The gleaming halls of the Galactic Medical Center always felt too cold to Dr. James Miller. Even after 5 years of working here, he never quite got used to the temperature maintained for the comfort of various alien species. Today, however, his mind wasn't on the cold. His attention was completely focused on the unusual medical charts floating on his holographic display. The patient waiting in room 407 was different from his usual cases. Through the observation window, he could see her crystalline form catching and reflecting the soft medical bay lights. She was an Astrian, a species known for their semi-transparent, crystal-like bodies that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. Her official name was too complex for human pronunciation, so she had chosen to be called Blue, thanks to the gentle azure tint of her crystalline form. Dr. Miller took a deep breath and entered the room. "Good morning, Blue. I've reviewed your case files." He settled into his chair, noting how Blue's light dimmed slightly, a sign of distress in her species. "Then you know it's hopeless," Blue said, her voice carrying the slight musical chime typical of Astrians. 7 doctors, 3 different species, all say the same thing. "I cannot have children." The edges of her crystalline form dulled, a clear sign of deep sadness. Dr. Miller leaned forward, his weathered face reflecting in the facets of Blue's surface. "Tell me why they said it's impossible." He already knew the answer from her files, but he wanted to hear her perspective. "My growth chambers are malformed," Blue explained, touching the central part of her torso where Astrians typically formed new crystals, their version of reproduction. "The molecular structure is wrong. They say it can't support crystal formation. In your terms, I'm infertile." The last word came out with a bitter harmonic. Dr. Miller nodded, pulling up a 3-dimensional scan of Blue's internal structure. "I see what they're talking about. But," he paused, manipulating the image with practiced ease, zooming in on a particular section. Something caught his eye, a pattern he recognized from his studies of Earth minerals. Blue's lights pulsed with sudden interest. "But what?" "These patterns here," he pointed to a specific area of her growth chamber. "They remind me of something I've seen before in Earth's crystal caves. There's a phenomenon where certain minerals can still grow even with irregular structural patterns, given the right conditions." "But I'm not a cave crystal," Blue said, though her color brightened slightly with the first hints of hope she'd felt in years. Dr. Miller smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "No, you're not. You're something far more complex and beautiful. But the basic principles of crystal growth remain similar across the universe. These other doctors," he gestured at her medical history, "they're experts in biological reproduction. But maybe what we need here is a different perspective." He stood up and walked to the observation window, his reflection overlaying the bustling medical bay beyond. "Your species evolved from crystal-based life forms. What if we approach this not just as a biological problem, but as a crystallographic one?" Blue's entire form brightened noticeably. "What are you saying, Dr. Miller?" "I'm saying," he turned back to face her, "that I don't believe you're infertile. Different, yes. Challenging, certainly, but not impossible. If you're willing to try something new, something that hasn't been attempted before, I think we might have a chance." For the first time in years, Blue's light pulsed with pure joy, filling the room with dancing blue reflections. "You really think so?" Dr. Miller nodded, already making notes on his datapad. "It won't be easy. We'll need to study your crystal structure in detail, develop new approaches, maybe even create new equipment. But yes, I think so." He looked up at her with determination in his eyes. "If you're willing to trust a human doctor with some unusual ideas, I'm willing to do everything in my power to help you have a child." Blue's crystalline form shimmered with hope. "Yes," she said simply, her voice carrying harmonics of joy and gratitude. "Yes, I trust you." Dr. Miller smiled, already planning his research approach. Sometimes, he thought, it took human stubbornness and creativity to solve problems other species deemed impossible, and he was about to prove them all wrong. 2 weeks after their first meeting, Dr. Miller's office had changed dramatically. The once tidy space now looked like a cross between a geology lab and a medical research center. Crystals of various sizes and colors sat under special lights, and holographic displays showed complex molecular structures floating in the air. Blue watched with fascination as Dr. Miller carefully examined a piece of quartz under a microscope. "You've been studying Earth crystals every day," she observed, her own crystalline form reflecting the morning light streaming through the window. "Yes," he replied, not looking up from his work. "The more I learn about Earth crystal formation, the more I see similarities with your biology." He straightened up and rubbed his tired eyes. "Did you bring what I asked for?" Blue reached into a special containment field and pulled out a small, shimmering object. "This is a piece of my grandfather's final form," she said softly. "When Astrians die, we leave behind our purest crystal essence. Families keep them as memories." Dr. Miller accepted the precious crystal with careful hands. "Thank you for trusting me with this. It will help us understand how healthy Astrian crystal growth should look." He placed it under a special scanner, and new images appeared in the air above them. "In my culture," Blue said, watching the scanner work, "not being able to form new crystals is seen as a great sadness. Some believe it means our ancestors think we are unworthy." Her light dimmed slightly. "My family supports me, but others, they whisper." Dr. Miller turned away from his equipment, giving Blue his full attention. "Tell me more about how crystal formation usually works for your people." "When we reach maturity," Blue explained, her lights pulsing gently as she spoke, "our inner chamber creates perfect conditions for new crystal growth. It usually takes 3 cycles of our home moon for a new crystal to form fully. The baby Astrian emerges from this crystal, already capable of basic light communication." She touched her central chamber sadly. "But my inner chamber can't create those conditions." "Interesting," Dr. Miller muttered, comparing the scan of the grandfather's crystal to Blue's recent medical scans. "Very interesting." He pulled up another display, this one showing the structure of various earth minerals. "Look at this," he pointed to a particular pattern. "This is how crystals form in Earth's deepest caves. The pressure, temperature, and mineral content have to be exactly right." Blue moved closer, her curiosity evident in her brightening lights. "It does look similar to our growth patterns." "Exactly." Dr. Miller's excitement was visible on his face. "Your species may have evolved from crystal formations, but the basic rules of crystal growth still apply. We just need to understand them better." He picked up a small, perfectly formed amethyst from his desk. "This crystal grew in conditions that most would consider impossible, yet here it is." "What does that mean for me?" Blue asked, hope creeping into her harmonic tones. Dr. Miller smiled, the kind of smile that had gotten him through many seemingly impossible cases. "It means we have a starting point. Your chamber's conditions might not be typical for Astrian crystal growth, but that doesn't mean we can't find new conditions that will work." He stood up and walked to a large machine in the corner of his office. "I've been working on this for the past week. It's a specialized chamber that can precisely control temperature, pressure, and electromagnetic fields. If we can understand exactly how your grandfather's crystal formed, we might be able to recreate similar conditions in a way that works with your unique chamber structure." Blue's form sparkled with renewed hope. "No other doctor has ever tried something like this." "Well," Dr. Miller said, making some adjustments to the machine, "maybe that's because they were looking at it as just a medical problem. Sometimes you need to step back and see the bigger picture." He turned to face Blue, determination clear in his eyes. "We're going to prove that different doesn't mean impossible. It just means we need to find a new way." Blue's light pulsed with gratitude and growing excitement. For the first time since her diagnosis, she felt like she was more than just a medical failure. She was part of something new, something that might change everything. Not just for her, but for others like her. The meeting room of the Galactic Medical Center was packed with doctors from various species. Dr. Miller stood at the front, surrounded by floating holograms showing his research. Blue sat in the back, her crystalline form dim with nervousness. "What you're suggesting is impossible," said Dr. Rock, a heavy-gravity species doctor whose thick scales showed his age. "Artificial crystal growth conditions cannot replace natural Astrian reproduction." Dr. Miller took a deep breath. He had expected this reaction. "With all due respect, we've already achieved successful crystal growth in our test chambers." He brought up a new hologram showing time-lapse footage of a small crystal forming under controlled conditions. "Growing a simple crystal is not the same as creating life," another doctor argued. This one was Dr. Leaf, her plant-based form swaying with agitation. "The Astrian reproductive process is far more complex." "You're right," Dr. Miller agreed, surprising his critics. "It is more complex. That's why we're not just growing crystals." He gestured, and the hologram changed to show a detailed scan of Blue's growth chamber. "We're recreating the exact conditions found in healthy Astrian reproduction, but with modifications to work with Blue's unique chamber structure." The room filled with murmurs. Blue's lights pulsed anxiously as she watched the other doctors' reactions. "Impossible," Dr. Rock rumbled again. "The energy requirements alone are managed through this electromagnetic field system," Dr. Miller interrupted, bringing up another diagram. "We found that by using precisely controlled electromagnetic pulses, we can stimulate crystal growth patterns that match natural Astrian formation." Dr. Leaf leaned forward, her leaves rustling thoughtfully. "But the risks. If your calculations are wrong, you could cause permanent damage to the patient's crystal structure." Blue stood up then, her voice carrying clear harmonics of determination. "I understand the risks," she said, moving to stand beside Dr. Miller. "And I choose to try. Better to try and fail than live forever wondering what might have been." The room fell silent. Dr. Miller smiled at Blue's courage before continuing. "We've run over 300 simulations. The process is safe. The worst that could happen is that the crystal won't form. Exactly the same situation we have now." He pulled up one final hologram, this one showing the successful growth of a test crystal that perfectly matched Astrian cellular patterns. "This test sample shows all the early signs of viable crystal formation. The molecular structure is exactly what we see in natural Astrian reproduction." An older Astrian doctor in the front row leaned forward, her crystalline form showing deep purple swirls of concern. "In my 200 years of practice, I have never seen anything like this. But," she paused, studying the data carefully, "I cannot deny the evidence before me. The crystal patterns are remarkably similar to natural formation." Dr. Miller nodded gratefully. "All we're asking for is permission to proceed with a controlled trial. Blue has already volunteered, and we have all safety protocols in place." The medical board members looked at each other. Finally, Dr. Rock spoke again, his voice slightly less certain than before. "Your theory is interesting, human, but theory and practice are different things. That's why we need to try," Dr. Miller said firmly. "Humans have a saying, 'Nothing is impossible until it's been proven impossible.' We haven't proven this impossible yet. In fact, all our evidence suggests it's very possible." Blue's lights brightened with hope as she watched more and more doctors nodding thoughtfully. Even Dr. Leaf seemed to be reconsidering. The head of the medical board, a wise old doctor from a species that looked like living smoke, finally spoke. "Your request for a controlled trial is approved, Dr. Miller." But the smoke swirled meaningfully. "You will be held responsible for any negative outcomes." "I understand," Dr. Miller said solemnly, "and I accept that responsibility." He turned to Blue, whose crystal form was now shimmering with joy. "Ready to make medical history?" Blue's answer lit up the entire room with hopeful blue light. "More than ready. Let's show them what's possible when humans and Astrians work together." The specialized treatment room hummed with energy as Dr. Miller made final adjustments to the crystal growth chamber. The machine was beautiful in its own way, a perfect blend of human engineering and Astrian crystal technology. Blue lay on the treatment bed nearby, her crystalline form reflecting the soft blue lights of the medical equipment. "Remember," Dr. Miller said, checking the readings one last time, "if you feel any discomfort at all, any sensation that doesn't feel right, tell me immediately." He looked up at the observation window where several medical board members watched with varying degrees of skepticism. "I understand," Blue replied, her voice carrying harmonics of both nervousness and excitement. "My family is waiting outside. They're all hoping this works." Dr. Miller nodded, remembering the group of shimmering Astrians he'd seen in the waiting area. "We've done everything possible to prepare. Now it's time to try." He pressed several controls, and the chamber began to power up. The electromagnetic field will feel strange at first, but it shouldn't hurt. As the field activated, Blue's crystal structure began to glow softly from within. The chamber's internal sensors showed perfect alignment with their planned parameters. Everything was going exactly as they had hoped. "How do you feel?" Dr. Miller asked, watching both Blue and the monitoring equipment carefully. "It feels warm," Blue answered, her lights pulsing gently, "like standing in sunlight. Is that normal?" "Yes, that's exactly what we want." Dr. Miller adjusted one final control. "Now comes the hard part, maintaining these conditions for the next 6 hours." Time passed slowly in the treatment room. Dr. Miller stayed by the controls, making tiny adjustments whenever the readings shifted even slightly. Blue remained still, her lights occasionally flickering with hope or anxiety. Above them, the medical board members took turns watching, making notes, and whispering among themselves. 4 hours into the treatment, the first warning signal appeared. "The crystal formation patterns are becoming unstable," Dr. Miller muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. "Blue, are you feeling any discomfort?" "No," she answered, but her voice carried worried harmonics. "But I can feel something changing. The warmth is different now." Dr. Miller frowned at the readings. The electromagnetic field was maintaining its strength, but the crystal growth patterns weren't following their predicted path. Something was wrong. "The pressure in the growth chamber is fluctuating," one of the monitoring nurses called out. "We're losing the formation pattern." Dr. Miller worked frantically to stabilize the field, but he could see the crystal structure beginning to break down. "Blue, I'm going to have to stop the treatment. The patterns are becoming too unstable." "No, please." Blue's voice rang with desperation. "Just a little longer. Please try." But Dr. Miller knew they couldn't risk it. With heavy hearts, he shut down the chamber. The humming stopped, and the warm glow faded from Blue's form. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Blue spoke, her voice soft but steady. "It didn't work, did it?" Dr. Miller shook his head. "Not this time." But he quickly added, looking at her reading, "We learned something important. The initial crystal formation patterns were perfect. We just couldn't maintain them." "So, there's still hope?" Blue asked, her lights dimming slightly with disappointment, but not going dark. "Absolutely," Dr. Miller said firmly. "This wasn't a failure. It was a lesson. Now we know what works and what doesn't. We can adjust our approach." He looked up at the observation window, where the medical board members were already discussing the results. Science isn't about getting it right the first time. It's about learning from each attempt. Blue sat up slowly, her crystal form catching the light. "When can we try again?" Dr. Miller smiled at her determination. "First, we analyze what happened today. Then we make improvements. And then," he patted her shoulder gently, "we try again. Different approach, same goal." Up in the observation room, even Dr. Rock had to admit that the initial crystal formation patterns had been impressive. Maybe, just maybe, this human doctor wasn't completely crazy after all. 3 weeks after their first attempt, Dr. Miller sat in his office late at night, surrounded by holographic displays showing data from their failed trial. He rubbed his tired eyes, reaching for his 5th cup of coffee. Something was missing. Something important. The door chimed softly. "Come in," he called, expecting it to be the night nurse doing rounds. Instead, Blue entered, her crystal form glowing softly in the dim office. "You're still here," she said, not sounding surprised at all. "My family said you might be." "I can't stop thinking about the pattern breakdown," Dr. Miller said, gesturing at the displays. "We were so close. The initial formation was perfect, but then—" He trailed off, staring at one particular data stream. Blue moved closer, her light reflecting off the coffee cup. "You need rest," she said gently. "Even humans can't work forever." "Wait." Dr. Miller suddenly sat up straight, spilling his coffee. "Wait a minute." He frantically pulled up two different displays side by side. One showed the failed crystal formation pattern. The other showed natural Earth crystal growth cycles. "What is it?" Blue asked, noting his sudden excitement. "We've been trying to maintain constant conditions," Dr. Miller said, his fingers flying over the controls. "But look at this. Natural crystal formation isn't constant. It pulses. It changes." He looked up at Blue, his eyes bright with realization. "What if we've been too careful? Too controlled?" He jumped up and started pacing, something he always did when excited. In nature, crystals form through cycles of pressure and temperature changes. Even electromagnetic fields in caves pulse and shift. He turned to Blue. "What if your growth chamber needs the same thing?" Blue's lights brightened with interest, but the other doctors always said stable conditions were essential. "For normal Astrian reproduction, yes," Dr. Miller agreed. "But your chamber is different. What if it needs—" He paused, pulling up new calculations, a more Earth-like approach. Working quickly, Dr. Miller began modifying their treatment protocols. Instead of maintaining steady conditions, he designed a pulsing pattern of electromagnetic fields, varying pressure, and shifting temperature gradients. The new pattern looked more like Earth's natural crystal caves than a typical Astrian growth chamber. "Look at this simulation," he said, showing Blue the new pattern. "It's less stable, but more natural. More like how crystals first formed on both our worlds." The simulation ran, showing crystal growth that looked different from traditional Astrian patterns, but it was growing steadily, strongly, and most importantly, it was stable. Blue studied the simulation, her lights pulsing with growing excitement. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Different, but beautiful." Dr. Miller nodded, already making preparations to present their new approach. "We've been so focused on copying normal Astrian reproduction that we forgot something important. Life finds a way, even if it's not the usual way." The next morning, they presented the new protocol to the medical board. This time, even Dr. Rock looked interested as Dr. Miller explained their breakthrough. Instead of fighting against Blue's unique chamber structure, Dr. Miller explained, showing the pulsing patterns, "We're working with it. Yes, it's different from normal Astrian reproduction, but different doesn't mean wrong." The older Astrian doctor who had supported them before spoke up, her crystal form showing swirls of deep thought. "This is unlike anything in our medical records," she admitted. "But perhaps that's exactly why it might work." Dr. Leaf studied the simulations carefully. "The patterns are strange, but the crystal growth is undeniable, and the safety protocols are solid." The medical board huddled together, discussing in low voices. Finally, they turned back to Dr. Miller and Blue. "You have permission for another trial," the head of the board announced. "But be careful. This is completely new territory." Blue's lights shone with pure joy as she turned to Dr. Miller. "When can we start?" Dr. Miller smiled, already planning the preparations. "Tomorrow morning. Tonight. We both need rest." He looked at the beautiful, pulsing patterns on his display. "Tomorrow, we make history." The treatment room was different this time. Instead of the steady hum of the previous attempt, the new chamber created a gentle, pulsing rhythm that reminded Dr. Miller of waves on a beach. Blue lay inside, her crystalline form synchronized with the changing patterns of light and energy. 4 hours in, Dr. Miller announced quietly. The observation room was packed, not just with medical board members this time, but with other doctors and researchers who had heard about their new approach. All patterns are holding steady. Blue's family waited outside, holding their own vigil. Inside the chamber, Blue remained perfectly still, her lights pulsing in harmony with the electromagnetic fields. "Doctor," one of the nurses called softly, "look at these readings." Dr. Miller moved to her station, and his eyes widened. In Blue's growth chamber, tiny crystalline structures were beginning to form. Not in the usual Astrian pattern, but in a new, beautiful formation that combined the best of both worlds. "Blue," he called gently, "how are you feeling?" "Warm," she answered, her voice carrying harmonics of wonder, "but different from last time. I can feel something." Her lights flickered with emotion. "Something is happening." The next 2 hours passed in tense anticipation. The crystal formation continued to grow, following the pulsing patterns they had designed. Even Dr. Rock, watching from above, had to admit that the readings were impressive. Then, at the 6-hour mark, something amazing happened. The crystal structure, the nurse gasped, it's stabilizing on its own. Dr. Miller checked the readings, hardly daring to believe it. The artificial pulses were no longer necessary. The crystal formation had developed its own natural rhythm. It was growing, strengthening, becoming something new and wonderful. "Blue," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I think it's working." Blue's entire form lit up with joy, sending rainbow reflections dancing across the room. "I can feel it," she whispered. "I can feel the growth. It's beautiful." In the observation room, the older Astrian doctor was recording everything. "Remarkable," she kept saying. "Simply remarkable." Hour 7 passed, then 8. The crystal formation continued to grow stronger. By hour 9, there was no doubt. They had done it. Inside Blue's growth chamber, a perfect crystal structure was forming, showing all the signs of healthy Astrian reproduction. Dr. Miller finally allowed himself to smile. "I think we can end the treatment now," he said. "The process is self-sustaining." He looked up at the observation window. Would the medical board agree? The board members huddled together, reviewing the data. Finally, they gave their approval. Carefully, Dr. Miller powered down the chamber. The pulsing lights faded away, but the glow from Blue's central chamber remained, now coming entirely from the new crystal formation within. "Congratulations," he said softly as Blue sat up. "You're going to be a mother." Blue's lights shone so brightly that everyone had to shield their eyes. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics of pure joy that no one in the room had ever heard before. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for not giving up." The door burst open as Blue's family rushed in, having heard the news. The room filled with the beautiful light of celebrating Astrians, their crystal forms creating a spectacular light show of happiness. Dr. Miller stepped back, watching the family celebration with tired but happy eyes. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Dr. Rock. "Well, human," the scaled doctor rumbled. "It seems I was wrong. You've done the impossible." Dr. Miller shook his head, smiling. "Not impossible," he corrected. "Just different. Sometimes that's all it takes, looking at things in a new way." Through the happy chaos, Blue turned to look at Dr. Miller, her lights pulsing with gratitude and joy. In that moment, he knew that they had done more than just help one person. They had opened a door for others like her, proving that being different didn't mean being broken. It was, he thought, watching the celebration, one of the best kinds of human stubbornness. The kind that refused to accept impossible as an answer. 3 months later, the Galactic Medical Center's main conference hall was filled to capacity. Doctors, researchers, and journalists from across the galaxy had gathered for a historic moment. On the stage, Dr. Miller stood next to Blue, whose crystal form now held a smaller, perfectly formed crystal structure within, her growing child. The success of this treatment, Dr. Miller explained to the crowd, proves that we must sometimes look beyond traditional methods. By combining Earth's crystal formation patterns with Astrian biology, we created something new, a bridge between our worlds. Blue's lights pulsed with pride as she showed the audience her developing child. The small crystal formation caught the light, sending rainbow patterns dancing across the walls. Unlike traditional Astrian reproduction crystals, this one had unique patterns that sparkled in a way no one had seen before. Each pulse of light, Blue explained, her voice carrying joyful harmonics, is my child communicating. Already so active, so full of life. She turned to Dr. Miller. And all because one human doctor refused to believe in impossible things. In the front row, Dr. Rock nodded approvingly. Next to him, Dr. Leaf's leaves swayed with excitement as she took notes. The medical board members who had once doubted now sat in amazed silence, watching the proof of their success. We've already received requests from other Astrians with similar conditions, Dr. Miller continued. With Blue's permission, we're establishing a new department at the medical center, specifically focused on adaptive reproductive treatments. He smiled at his patient, who had become a friend. Blue has agreed to help counsel future patients. The older Astrian doctor who had supported them from the beginning stood up. In all my years of practice, I never imagined seeing something like this. You have given hope to many who had none. Her crystal form shimmered with emotion. Our medical records will need to be rewritten. After the presentation, in a quieter moment, Blue and Dr. Miller stood by the window overlooking the medical center's gardens. Outside, crystal flowers from the Astrian homeworld grew alongside earth roses, different but equally beautiful. My child will be born in 2 weeks, Blue said softly. The first of a new kind of Astrian. Different, but perfect in their own way. She turned to Dr. Miller. Will you be there? I wouldn't miss it for anything, he replied, smiling. Have you decided on a name? Blue's lights sparkled with amusement. In our tradition, we name children after the qualities we hope they will have. She paused, her lights forming complex patterns. I'm naming them Hope, but in a way that combines Astrian and human sounds, because they are proof that hope crosses all species boundaries. Dr. Miller felt his eyes growing moist. That's perfect. A young Astrian couple approached them then, both looking nervous but hopeful. Doctor, one of them said, lights pulsing anxiously, we heard about your success. We've been told we can't have children, but maybe. Come to my office tomorrow morning, Dr. Miller said warmly. We'll start with some tests and see what we can do. As the couple left, their lights notably brighter, Blue spoke again. You've changed everything, you know. Not just for me, but for so many others. Dr. Miller shook his head. We changed everything, he corrected. Human determination and Astrian courage, working together. That's what made this possible. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the garden where Earth and Astrian plants grew side by side. In 2 weeks, a new life would join their world, one that proved that differences could be strengths, that impossible was just a word, and that hope, combined with determination, could create miracles. Above them, the stars twinkled through the station's dome, reminding them that in this vast galaxy, there were probably many more impossible things just waiting for someone brave enough to try, someone stubborn enough to persist, and someone wise enough to see that different paths could lead to the same beautiful destination.